All right. Well, welcome to this interview, NBPoliPod listeners. We are really excited to have a guest on our show. Many of you, if you're on TikTok or have been following us on our socials or our Instagram, or even in listening to our podcast, you will have heard us refer to this now infamous housing TikToker, MillennialMoron. So we are excited to have him on the show with us, and we're going to deep dive obviously housing. We're going to deep dive some political issues around the country, around our province, and get into a wider discussion on what's going on, who's to blame, and why we're in the situation where we have a dumpster fire of a housing crisis on our hands. So without further ado, welcome to the show, my friend. We're really excited to have you.
Yeah, hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah. So can you let's just start off, obviously your TikTok handle is MillennialMoron, and you've gotten a lot of traction. You're up to 3 million followers now, I think, on TikTok.
Oh, no, 3 million likes. I've got 130 something thousand followers.
Perfect. So still ridiculously successful as far as TikTok accounts go. So what got you into that, and what perspective were you bringing? Where did you get started with that? I mean, the first time I would have saw you was literally your first video on comparing Canadian real estate to European castles, and that's where we started following. I don't know where you came from, Joe. What your first interaction was
Oh
account
yeah,
like?
the algorithm knew that your content was exactly the kind of stuff that I would love to see, and I've been a big fan of your data-driven approach when you bring out the Excel sheets, when you challenge the landlords, challenge the realtors. So I've been just a big fan of the way you're looking at this stuff and how you present this information to people on a platform that's kind of, newer to Canadians. So yeah, I'd love to hear a little bit more why you chose TikTok too as a platform to deliver this on.
Yeah, well, I guess it really started, maybe 10 or 12 years ago when I was looking at the housing market and I was kind of just starting my career and thinking, oh, should I be buying a place? And to me, none of the numbers made any sense because I'm a very analytical person. And so I've just been following the trend in our real estate market for, like I said, the last 10 or 12 years. And then several years ago, I had this idea of comparing. I wanted to see how many crummy rundown houses in Canada you would need to buy a private island, and it turns out the answer is one. And so I had meant to do this idea for a long time, but I could just never find the format that I thought it would be funny enough to publish it in.
Mm.
And then more recently, I was looking at the video editing tools and capabilities of platforms like TikTok, especially with
Mhm.
the green screen backgrounds and things where you can present visual information and talk over it really easily. And so I decided to make a couple of videos on that theme, and it really took off. And then that's now grown into a lot of people were asking, well, what's going on in Canada? Why are things so ridiculous? And then I started doing explanation videos, and now I'm getting a little bit more into affordable housing and how that could possibly be achieved and what the roadblocks have been to doing it.
Nice. So you say one crummy house in Canada, one crummy rundown house could buy a private island.
Yep.
What island is that?
Oh, that was my first series. I think there's about 8 videos on that. So I have
Yeah. So
yeah,
various islands, then not just one.
yeah, and they're often developed islands that have sort of a resort like place already built on them.
Yeah, if you haven't checked it out, it's unbelievable. Sort of like the little docks and the little guest houses and all these wonderful
Yeah.
spots, And then you look at this like very sad place in downtown Vancouver, or even on an outskirt or a suburb.
Yeah.
So I know you'll be new to some of our New Brunswick folk because it just, again, it's something that we haven't been paying attention to because for so long here we've been the cheapest place to live. And even
Still
just the
are,
other day,
apparently.
just the other day, our city tweeted that we have been named Canada's most affordable city. Yet the people who live here can't afford to purchase homes here. It's
Yeah.
people from other places in Canada. So I'm wondering about your perspective on sort of this conundrum that we're in on the East Coast. We've always been the cheapest place to live. And now it's like we're just this playground for Ontarians and people from BC.
Yeah, I think that's definitely something you can see, especially if you look at the data. the prices on the East Coast have just skyrocketed in the last few years. It's really shocking. You're looking at, 150, 200% increases in the space of just a few years. And I know from talking to people in New Brunswick and the rest of the Maritimes that um, even compared to, I would say, Ontario or BC, rents have skyrocketed really quickly.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And you see this in a lot of the more affordable areas throughout Canada, is that now people are sort of fleeing Ontario or fleeing BC looking for, a more sane lifestyle where they're not constantly just trying to get by, even if they have, two good jobs with good incomes. They're looking for a place where they can have a normal life, right? And
Yeah.
a lot of that, unfortunately, means going out to other provinces where people typically have lower incomes. They don't have as much capital built up, and they can't compete with people who are coming in from these bigger financial centers.
Do you so I like the root cause of this is like always the one I find most interesting to talk to people about. Um, we've had a few different theories that we've talked about as to what led to this, when it all started to go sideways, because it really is like, I mean, I guess I'll a precursor to that question. So, like, what do you think some of the root causes are? We were recently at a Federation of Canadian Municipalities conference in Toronto. So it's like the largest gathering of elected officials in the country, mostly because there's so many municipalities, right? So you get all the mayors and councilors from all across the country that gather at this at once a year. And David Coletto was there giving an address, a keynote. And one of the things he said I found interesting was, from a historical data perspective, from a political sort of polling perspective, when you see, and he goes outside of Canada for this to reference it, when you see places that have a healthcare crisis, or they have a local climate, disaster or something like that. There are blips, there are things that happen, there are reactions politically, people get voted out, but it's pretty stable, even through something like a healthcare crisis. But when you see a housing crisis, when people become more and more insecure about their shelter, that's when his point is that the politics can take a really weird turn, and you can start to see just complete table turning of the political spectrum as well as the political landscape in those countries. And he was basically giving that as a warning to say, look, if we don't get this under control here soon, we are all going to be likely witnessing some of those pretty severe political reactions. And of course, not that the housing crisis had everything to do with it, but we've already seen some pretty intense, weird Canadian political things happen, from the convoy to, you name it, in the last 4 years. So I guess, like, within that, when you're looking at this as an issue, is there a date, or is there a time, or is there a party or a person that you would say, like, this was a turning point in the Canadian I guess the health of the Canadian housing sector?
Well, it's hard to nail anything down to one specific cause. I think a lot of people want to say, here's one cause, here's what happened, so we can have
Yeah.
one solution and get ourselves out of it. But it's many things that have been building on each other for a long time. To me, I think the turning point for a lot of stuff was the 2008 financial crisis,
Right.
because that has had profound effects on, people around our age. Their careers have been drastically affected by that, right? That was kind of the point where we went from each generation doing better and better than the last to now people seem to be doing worse and worse. And I think a lot of the major sentiments, both on the left and the right, kind of come out of that. It's from a feeling that there are some very wealthy people at the top. There's wealth concentrated in the hands of a very few people, and they are manipulating the entire system to the benefit of themselves and the detriment of everyone else. And in that sense, I think, something like Occupy Wall Street, but also
Yep.
the convoy, those are kind of like two sides of the
Mm.
same coin, just expressed
Reactionary.
through people who have different, like, overarching worldviews. But I think the idea of this deep frustration with feeling like we have no agency against a larger system that's working against us is where a lot of that sentiment comes from.
Yeah, and it certainly shows that. Like, I mean, voter turnout continues to decrease, and it continues to suffer. And
Mhm.
I mean, here in New Brunswick, I mean, here in this where we're at right now in this riding in New Brunswick, it's like the lowest voter turnout in the province, which is one of the lowest in the country. And of course, it's no mistake that here in this riding, it's so funny. We have one of the biggest GDP earners in the country because we have the largest oil refinery right here, and we have three companies with global valuations of over $1 billion. Their headquarters are here. So we have three billionaires in town. And we also have the highest rate of child poverty. We have the highest rate of dilapidation amongst buildings, one per capita, one of the highest rates of abandonment of buildings. And like, it's just a bizarre kind of microcosm right here in St. John, in New Brunswick, for like kind of the what you're talking about, this perspective that people have on who's doing better and who's not. I guess like my follow-up question to that and point of discussion is like, do we think there's anything substantial happening in the conversations or political discourses around the country um, that can give us hope that we're going to turn that corner for the housing piece anyway, um, anytime soon?
Quite possibly. I mean, you're finally seeing, for example, people on the political right are being more advocates for affordable housing, right, at the federal level as well as in most provincial issues. And I think the reason for this is because things have gotten so bad that everyone is struggling now. And so there's more unity on some of these issues like the cost of living.
Yeah.
People may have different ideas on the solutions, but at least everyone is talking about the same issues. There's the cost of housing, there's the cost of groceries, there's everything. And now the shadow housing minister for the Conservatives, Scott Aitchison, is actually quite a staunch advocate for affordable housing, as you probably already know. I assume you know more about it than I do.
I don't know much about Scott. I did see that, and I've been following the Conservatives for a while. Like, even in the last federal campaign, one of the things I said was a great idea that the Conservatives are running on. Liberals and the Conservatives both had policy ideas that I thought would be fantastic if we got them done. For the Conservatives, it was basically micro targeting rapid transit corridors to promote densification, right? Which I've heard some people say, oh, well, they tried that in Vancouver and it didn't work. I'm like, well, it may or may not have. I don't know what to think about that. But from a principle perspective, that makes all the sense to be densifying those corridors where car ownership is not as required because you have the ability to get around without it. And that increases your income, right? Because you're not paying for your car, you're paying for transit, and on and on. But the Liberals had one as well, which I thought was like the cat's ass if we could get it done, which was use it or lose it legislation. So their pitch in their platform was if you are sitting on land or property and not selling it or not developing it, that the federal government would actually pass legislation to intervene and expropriate that, so that it could be. And we see that like that's a huge issue in St. John. We've got 52 buildings that are abandoned that are totally able to be renovated that we just can't claw back from private owners and who won't sell it, and for reasons we don't understand because we're not entitled to know, right? It's private land, private whatever. And then we've got another 140 on our dangerous and dilapidated buildings list where there are people living in it, but it's like not in good shape. Their envelopes are deteriorating and they're questionable, right? So those two pieces would have been great to work in tandem. But yeah, I've definitely seen the Conservatives turn a corner on this, and we're not seeing the same thing here for the Conservatives in New Brunswick. In New Brunswick, we're still seeing a lot of allegiance. I don't know if you would agree with this, Joe, but we're still seeing a lot of allegiance with the Conservative Party here, at least, and quite frankly, the Liberals. A lot of allegiance to private ownership and to like leave that sacred cow as it is, and we'll fix the housing crisis by doing all these other things like, I mean, they're not even putting a rent cap on it here. They're just throwing money at the issue here, really. But
Yeah, so I think the approach here again is to fund the landlord. It's there's a rent bank being created.
Yeah.
They're trying to give people, access to a set amount for sort of like the feds did with our $500 rent subsidy, and setting up that kind of approach to it versus building some of this housing themselves and housing people and bringing it all under their jurisdiction. Everyone seems to be a bit of a Spider-Man meme about this and pointing to each other and saying it's the city, it's the province, it's the feds. So one of the things I liked, though, that you said recently, or maybe you may have said this multiple times, was about how we do the banking side of it, because I don't think we talk about that enough. And you said about owning secondary, and third, fourth properties, and just even saying you cannot keep getting this 5% down payment option as you continue to quote unquote like live in these primary residence and then rent them out. So I am at a loss on how to advocate for that bigger change to some of these banking policies that limit our ability to allow more people to own things. So I don't know if you can elaborate on that piece, because it seems like you've done a lot of work there.
Yeah, I mean that would be basically tinkering with mortgage insurance rules
Yes.
and just general mortgage regulations, probably through the OFSI, the banking regulator. So what I had pitched was basically saying if you have a second property or if you already own a property, then you can't get this like primary residence high ratio mortgage exemption, because even if you're using it as your primary residence, you already own a property. You don't need this highly advantageous mortgage to start acquiring more, right?
Mhm.
And you could do the same thing even with secondary properties. Just say you can't um, leverage the property 5 to 1. You need more than a 20% down payment if it's a secondary property for a mortgage. And they're starting to do that a little bit with home equity lines of credit. They're changing the rules a bit so you can't take as much equity out of your home through a HELOC, which was a big part of the strategy that a lot of people were using, which was called buy, renovate, rent,
Burrs.
refinance.
Yeah.
And yeah, exactly. So people would buy the house, and as they were doing this, home prices were going up and up, so they were building equity rapidly. Then once they were ready, after a year or 6 months or whatever it was, they would borrow all the money back out from the house through a HELOC and then use that to acquire another property. And it's this kind of financialization and commodification of housing that's causing a lot of investor demand, because it has been so easy to acquire multiple properties and have the whole thing supported by what was very cheap debt for a period of 10 years or so. Now I do think with interest rates going up so quickly, a lot of that is going to start unraveling on its own,
Yeah.
which was really always the risk that we had, is that
Yeah.
when we have a housing market, but even just an overall economy that's really saturated with debt, if the cost of debt goes up, then a lot of things are going to start falling apart.
Yeah. Do you think that's a bubble burst, or do you think it's just a rapid decline, or like I stand here and it's like I often wonder, like we go back to the original problem you're talking about, 2008 being that turning point. I think I agree, and we Joe and I've talked about this. We used a portion of a podcast with George Monby in it to kind of prod a conversation we were having. Because one of the things he says is like 2008 really is that point where neoliberalism completely collapsed as an idea, and we can see different collapses of ideologies that kind of create our unifying field theories about how the world works or should work or what's going to solve the problems. And like, he talks about John Maynard Keynes, when the Edwardian kind of era of laissez-faire economics failed in the 20s into the 30s, that there was John Maynard Keynes with his Keynesian economics, and that carried us to the 70s, where there was a bunch of toxic and decaying stuff within that neoliberalism came in to displace, and then neoliberalism failed in 2008, but then there's been nothing to replace it. I think what I'm hearing you say, and I guess what I'm looking at as well, is like we're still kind of in that hangover of a lack of new direction to go in on housing. I think there's still a lot of people that think if you just let the market figure it out. It'll figure it out, and just get the banks out of the way. Like we hear this from Pierre Poilievre all the time. Eliminate the red tape. Get municipalities out of the way because the municipalities just work for the NIMBYs, and the NIMBYs are the problem, and all this stuff. And like we're out here saying, well, Jesus, we've got 2,300 units approved that the municipality has done work on to approve for zonings and things like that. But we can't get people to come back and build. And then we have some of these free market types come back to us and say, well, that's because the economics has changed around their build because of interest rates and costs. So the project's just going to sit because it's a bad investment. And I keep thinking to myself, like, how can shelter ever be a bad investment? Like, what are the numbers like that? Like, I get like a bank's going to stress test you and say, well, your cost of borrowing versus how much money you can make on your units versus what the average market rate is in rent, like all that. They're going to take all that and put it in and say, well, we can approve you for this financing or not.
Yeah,
But
it's a long-term like
Yeah.
reward. It's not, I get it's a risk for the next 5 to 10, but I don't see how they don't see past this.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, there's a confluence of things happening right now too. Like, there's a lot of supply chain issues and issues with the labor availability that stemmed from COVID, right? So you've got a lot of things that need to be built, but you might not even have the resources to get them built. But on top of that, when we're talking about let the free market figure it out, I think there is a lot of interference from governments at various levels, like federal and provincial. Like you said, there in New Brunswick, for example, you were saying that there's not a lot of interest in getting a lot of affordable housing built or in letting prices return to normal, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And that frankly doesn't surprise me because you have a large generational cohort of people who already own housing, right?
Yep.
And often they own it outright. And um, for a lot of younger people, of course, they're struggling with rents, they're struggling with getting into the market. But then you have a large cohort, which is a very large voting block, that has suddenly seen a massive increase in their wealth on paper in the
Mm.
Maritimes. And then in the rest of Canada, it's happened over the course of 15 years, right? And so they're approaching retirement and they need equity to retire with because a lot of them don't have as much savings as they
Yep.
would like to retire on. And so either by selling the house or by accessing that equity through something like a reverse mortgage, which is now the fastest growing form of debt in Canada,
Mm-hmm.
they're relying on that to fund their retirement and to continue living. And that's the pull from the other side, is that really nobody has enough money. You have one group of people that doesn't have enough money to enter the housing market and another group that in a way doesn't have enough money to exit the housing market.
Right.
So there's,
Interesting.
yeah, and like I said, that is a large voting block, and I think it would be very unpalatable to a lot of society to see, people who are approaching their senior years suddenly being unable to afford the basics of living. But at the same time, it's gotten so stretched that you have people at the lower end who just really can't even seem to get started and are struggling to meet the basic cost of living.
Yeah. So like, okay, I'm hearing a bit of a mixed thought on that one from your perspective. Like, so are you saying that government interference is still too severe and that is a main driver of the problem? Or are you saying the market is stupid and not, or like, how is it, like, what does that combination look like for you in how this is playing out? Because my thought is that the government exited housing as any sort of investment or engine of involvement in the 90s. Like here it was under Frank McKenna, nationally it was under John Chrétien, and everybody just stopped doing anything from a provincial perspective on housing, and we passed it over to the market to deal with. And I can't get past the idea that the market is incapable of solving this problem because the market will always prioritize profits, and profits are always following shortages, not surplus. So how do we even get started with the market? Because it's not rewarding surplus, it's rewarding shortage. But like, what? Yeah, I don't know. That's not necessarily everybody's perspective, but like, what would your thought be on that?
Uh, yeah, well, to that point, I would say that, in my opinion, the government is interfering too much, but they're interfering in the wrong direction. Like you said,
Okay.
they exited their involvement in housing, right? They used to build affordable housing.
Hmm.
I have a great chart I could show you about how, we used to be building tens of thousands of affordable units through federal programs every year, and then it collapsed to almost nothing for decades.
Yep.
And now, it's a little bit, but it's still quite lethargic compared to what it used to be.
Yeah.
But what they are doing, at least in my opinion, is trying to interfere in ways to make housing affordable, is what they claim, but really they're just giving people access to more debt.
Right.
And what that does is it keeps prices from correcting based on market forces. So, the market probably would have pushed prices down after 2008 were it not for the government stepping in to try to keep prices afloat. Right back in 2006, in their first budget, the federal conservatives introduced 40-year mortgages with zero down
Yep.
insured by the CMHC. So you have the government saying, okay, we're going to fund these kind of sketchy loans for a lot of money, but we're going to backstop them to prevent the banks from losing any money if things go south. And they eventually, to their credit, they did claw that back a bit over time.
Mm.
But we've also seen, allowing people to borrow more from their RSP, giving people the first home savings account, which again, you're giving the same tools to everyone in the market. You're
Mhm.
not really doing anything that's going to make housing more affordable by actually building more housing, right? When they implement these financial tools, they're not changing the amount of supply in the market, and they're not changing the amount of people who need to live in housing. All they're doing is saying, we're going to give you more access to more borrowed money.
Right.
And then people take that and they bid up the prices
Yep.
of the same houses more and more. I went into that in my last video on cheap debt, and
Mhm.
you see a really, really strong correlation between how much it costs to carry debt versus how much the price of a house is. So, as interest rates keep dropping, prices go up and up. And the government has, apart from interest rates, been implementing all these other tools that allow people to borrow more money, to carry more debt. And that's caused a huge inflation of the amount of debt that everyone is carrying. And if we want to go to what I think the root causes are, obviously there's,
Yeah.
15, 20 causes. But to me, the main cycle that's happening here is you've got cheap debt, which is allowing
Mhm.
people to borrow more money and push up the prices of housing. Then you've got a sort of fear of missing out, and this idea in our culture that housing is an invincible investment. You can't lose money on housing, and if you don't get in now, you might never get in.
Right.
And then you have this government interference to support that idea, because a lot of people have bet everything on housing, and if housing collapses, they will lose everything, and that flows into getting more cheap debt. And we've been going around in that circle for about 15 years now. And it seems like now that the bottom has fallen out of the cheap debt pillar, that whole thing could destabilize. And that's going to flow out to everything else.
Mhm. Joe, I'll give you a second if you want to chime in there.
Yes, I agree with all of that. And I think from looking at it from us as municipal level, we're seeing so much more in the unhoused area of our population. They're having a lot more people added to it every day. And, once again, we're having to make strategies down here because everyone else above us is just kind of scrambling. And, we're again the most affordable city. But we had 3 of our 4 proposed affordable housing RHI applications denied by CMHC.
Yeah.
So it's like we're not even able to access what they say is out there. And you'd think they just want to throw everything they can at the issue, but it's still a real big deal to be working with CMHC. And municipally, we have to take on a lot of risk for, I think it's like 40 years for the one project they did approve. If this guy, if something
Yeah, it's
happens,
47 units though. Like it's
yep.
it's such and this is the conservatives' big beef with the government is, and I hear it on the Curse of Politics all the time with Scott Reed and talking about all this ridiculous micro-targeting the liberals are doing, which is only hitting, 10% here and 10% there of people and not affecting us all enough to really change our mind about the direction. But when you say the bottom falling out of this, what are the, not the implications, because those are going to be impossible to understand, but I look at this and I think we're just going to have to make some really hard decisions. And I don't know how to escape the hard truth that at some point in time, people's houses are going to have to lose value. And that is going to mean retirement savings become like they're not accessible through your housing, the house that you have as a vehicle to retire with. And so then we're going to have to invest in more social security and support through CPP and things like that, which has always been plagued as a problem. So like society, like we need to make sure, because the risk of doing nothing right now, of trying to continue on this circle, is like we're going to have more homeless people. Like we have 194 in our city, most we've ever had. And, it used to be, I'll talk to a shelter guy the other day, and he said, it used to be, even just 10 years ago, 8 years ago, for sure. He said, like, if you saw homeless people, it was mostly men, and it was mostly because their wives kicked them out because they were too drunk, and they would have to stay on the cot for a few nights, or like, but now it's like, oh, I lost my job as whatever, and I couldn't make rent this month, and now I've got a new job working as a cashier, but I've already lost my apartment, and I'm living in a shelter until I can find something, but going to work every day. Like we had a number of people living in our out of the cold shelter here in St. John, working full time. And so to me, it's like, how can policymakers and government continue to go around that circle you're talking about? Because I don't even hear Pierre Poilievre necessarily, like the alternative. If we talk about Pierre being the alternative, or even Jagmeet Singh for that matter, at the NDP level federally, provincially, the conversation is nowhere near this nuanced in New Brunswick. So I can't even point to thought leaders in this province at a provincial political level. But like federally, there's these camps and they're all talking about it. But I don't see any of them really saying, we want to escape that circle you're talking about. Oh, you're just on mute there.
Sorry, yeah, I tried to shortcut unmute, didn't work. But yeah, I think you're exactly right, and there's a lot contained within what you just said. But as you said, there's two different groups that have two different opposite needs, and it's putting the government in a very awkward position because they want to have broad-based support. They want everyone to like them, which is why you have now our federal housing minister saying insane things like, "We want housing to be affordable, but we don't want house prices to drop." Like you can't have both. Like I'm sorry, it just doesn't work that way.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody's heart has to be broken,
Yeah.
and I think it's just a completely unavoidable consequence of this long sort of buildup of debt that we've been looking at. Right, we're kind of approaching what appears to be the end of a major credit cycle, and it's always going to be a painful process. Right, it seemed great for a lot of people when they were building up home equity and their cost of borrowing was going down, so they had tons of money to spend on whatever they wanted, and it was all financed by this cheap debt, and so people took on all this debt. But now the cost of that is going up, and we're going to see the big hangover of that borrowing phase. And right now it's causing problems at the low end because the government and other factors are trying to keep prices high, but it can't be sustained with all of these things pulling in different directions at the same time.
So do you think we need to do that, like to achieve that? I don't know, like someone's heart does have to be broken, and I think probably both do, right? Like people who think, people our age, I'm 34 and a little bit younger, um, like we're going to have to face the fact that we don't get to own a 2,000 square foot house in the suburbs. A lot of us don't want that anyway. Millennials are more likely than, or less likely than anybody to pursue that. I certainly never want to move back to the burbs, to a sterilized, box in a quarter-acre lot with a sterilized manicured lawn with a, just, I hate it anyway, but that's me. I think there's a lot of us like that, but I think millennials are in a place where ownership is just being taken off the table completely. So I think we're already in a place where it's like our hearts are already broken. We're moving forward, but we're having to suffer under the high rent and other options. And then, but I don't think boomers have had to have their heart broken at all in any way yet. Um, but like maybe I'm wrong about that.
I mean, from my perspective as a millennial, I would agree with you. I think
Yeah.
there have been a lot of things supporting them for a long time. But really, nobody wants to take one of these big hits, especially as they're approaching retirement. So, like I said, that every party is very, very scared to let prices drop. I think because it's going to have a lot of other knock-on consequences to it.
Mm.
But another thing is in that sense of what I said before about that cycle where you have the fear of missing out and people wanting to get into the market at any cost. I think there is a cultural element that needs to shift with the younger generations where we need to stop measuring our success and our happiness by the standards of a previous generation.
Yeah.
Like you said, you don't want a house in the suburbs. You don't want, a very sterile environment. You want to be in the middle of things and,
Mhm.
getting your hands dirty, and like that's good. That's a perfectly valid way to live. And, in
Mhm.
many other countries around the world, people will just rent their whole lives and there's no stigma around that, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there are advantages to it as well. Like, I own a place now because we had a sensible opportunity and motivation to buy a couple of years ago.
Mhm.
But for years, I could have bought a place and didn't because, I wanted to be flexible. I wanted to live downtown in the cities. I wanted to be able to move at a moment's notice without having to dispose of and reacquire a new property and without having to do what everyone else was doing, which was just become a landlord when you move. I didn't want to deal with that. Right.
Yeah.
Um, and again, I think that's a perfectly valid way to live. But at the time, a lot of people would tell me, if you're not getting into real estate, you're really um, basically selling your future away because renting is wasting your money. But it's not. You're buying a service, but
Mhm.
it needs to be in a market where that service is priced at a reasonable rate. Right now, things are getting pushed up so much because people purchased homes for an insane amount, and now their interest costs are rising. And that's just a financialization element. It's not a real element.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've definitely seen, we were both previous homeowners and
Mhm.
now are renters. So having watched, I personally watched my $180,000 home now worth $500,000 is just wild. And also seeing the price of rentals go up and being rent evicted and moved around. And, I'm 39, um, single mother, city councilor, and was moved out of my ward actually because I was outpriced from it, which is crazy. There's basically no rentals in the place where I was elected.
Yeah.
So luckily I found, some housing with a lovely friend who's my landlord. And there's so many situations that we see where like the spectrum of landlords, you talk about landlords a lot on your channel. And, we talk about how could we reward some of the ones that are just, yeah, we live in a duplex and I rent out the other side. I'm not someone buying up 15 properties and then putting a property manager in between me and the people that I rent to. Like, how can we make better landlord situations? Because there seems to be so many predatory situations that are come up in what you talk about.
Yeah. So one of the things that can be done, we already do have some advantages and more flexibility for landlords who live in the property that they're renting a portion of.
Yeah.
Mm,
And one of the ideas that has been happening in a few cities and Calgary, which is the one that I'm talking about right now, because they have a vote coming up.
Mm.
Their plan is to allow more secondary suites and backyard suites by default. So to
Mhm.
say, okay, it's going to be easier to subdivide your property and have a renter if you want to.
And we just did that in St. John about 3 months ago. We passed that. It's part of our
Yeah.
policy as well. So that's
Yeah.
not, you're saying that's not that common across the country.
Well, there's a lot of regulatory hurdles to it, right? There's red tape. For example, in Calgary right now, they need to be individually approved by um, basically like city administration, right?
Okay.
You need to make an application and say, I want to have a secondary suite, and then you need to meet all the regulatory codes, but it still needs to be approved. And there's other like rezoning issues that come along with that. Like people can try to fight secondary suites in their neighborhood, usually
Yeah.
over the issue of parking. But before
Mhm.
that, okay, it was even more ridiculous. Secondary suites had to be approved individually by city council at council meetings
Wow.
in a city of over 1 million people.
That's insane.
So part of it is just by liberalizing zoning regulations, letting people do what they want more easily,
Mhm.
and that'll help to alleviate some of that, and it'll make that kind of owner occupant landlord situation a little easier, and that'll kind of take away from the market of people who are buying up entire homes specifically to rent out, because people will have more choice in where they want to live if there are more options available.
Yeah, yeah, and I like to Joe's point. I think this idea that your neighbor has investment and skin in the game, and somebody who maybe owns 40 properties isn't going to care less if the roof is leaking, and the maintenance company is obviously not incentivized properly to look after the building because we have a lot of demand everywhere. Like our vacancy rate in St. John right now is about 1.7% residentially. It's about 6.5% commercially. That's about on average for the rest of the province as well. Really low vacancy, right? So it's not a renter's market right now. Property management companies just tell you to go pound sand. If you don't like the situation, then move, and then no one can figure out who the landlord is. I think that is like you say, that is going to change the game for the mom and pop sort of local landlord. I guess the other question I wanted to ask was, or maybe for us all have a chat about, is like, who have you done a lot of diving into who's doing it well, like outside of Canada, like who is doing housing as a system well? When we brought our motion last year to stand up a municipal housing entity, because we used to, St. John is Canada's oldest city. We actually had the first municipal housing corporation in the country that built the first public housing project in the country at Rockwood Park. Like, we're on that spectrum. We're a gritty blue collar town, union town, all of that. But at the same time, we all lost that in the 90s, like everybody else did. So we were kind of looking at Vienna saying, like, Jesus, there's this crazy city out there that, yeah, it's a slow growth, big city state kind of status reality, but it's 70% owned by the nonprofit and municipal government as far as housing stock go, and 30% owned by the private. And they seem to be completely insulated from the housing crisis. But is there others that you've looked to in your data that you're like, man, these are like the best practices out there?
Yeah, I haven't done much of a deep dive into other cities. I've been more focusing on what's being proposed here.
Right.
Vienna is one that people have mentioned to me a lot. Another one I think is Tokyo, where apparently rents are really not out of control, and part of that is that they just really opened up zoning and said build whatever you want, right? And so there's just a lot more housing that's been built there. There's a lot more units for people, and so despite it being a sort of economic center globally and having a very high population, it's not as wildly expensive to rent a place there as it is in a lot of Western countries. At least that's my understanding. I haven't looked into the specific numbers to check that, so I might be wildly off base. But that is one of the things that is a problem here, is that it's very expensive, both in terms of like zoning and land cost and development fees. Those all feed back into each other, right? When you have restrictive zoning, it pushes up the cost of land for things that are zoned for high density enormously, because that becomes very valuable land, because it's there's nothing different from this piece of land versus this piece of land in reality in the actual physical world. But we have a government that has decided, okay, this one you can build an apartment building on, and this one you can build a single family home on. And I think that's one of the keys as well. Like you said, vacancy rate is really low, and what we've had is a big decline in purpose-built rental housing being built. Whether it's affordable or market rate, it's just
Right.
not as much of it as being built in the last few decades, right? When was the last time you saw a company building an apartment building where they were going to continue owning it and rent out the units, versus a company putting up a condo tower so they could sell it off and wash their hands of the deal? Just
Well,
take
yeah,
their
to your
profits and
point,
go.
even in our city, we didn't see it for decades until like a year and a half ago. Like nobody built new apartments in our city until about a year and a half ago. Now we've got, I think, what do we got? 4 going up right now, Joe? About 300 units.
Yeah, about 300 units, and some bigger ones that are pretty impressive. But we've
That's
also
been,
experienced a whole bunch of speculators that have come in, rezoned the land, and then put it back up for sale like weeks later.
which is like, I don't know, do we need a land value tax instead of a property tax? Like, is that going to change the game around land values so that I mean, because you're right. Every serviced piece of land, it has a sidewalk, it has a street in front of it, it has pipes underground that run your sewage, your rainwater, and your water. There's no reason why it should be more expensive. The only difference is if you're going to build a 30-story building, it needs to have a far more extensive service system. So it does cost more to service that type of development, no question. But we find that too, like when we start looking at tax density maps, it looks like the purpose-built rental neighborhoods where there are apartments subsidize the suburbs because of how far away from the city core and services and how far you got to run asphalt, sidewalks, pipes. And like, I'm just wondering if that just as an idea in itself, I've heard it on Strong Towns and stuff as a land value tax, if that's going to change the dynamic and thinking enough to solve that. But I don't know if you've run up against that or not.
Well, it is a major issue when people talk about urban sprawl, right? These low density areas are much more expensive to service. There's a lot of development cost that goes into that. And often it's paid by the city. I think in Calgary, I believe they've switched over to making the developers of new neighborhoods pay the initial cost for that. But of course, there's still maintenance. You still have to keep it working over time, right?
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it's going to be less expensive if there's a bunch of dwelling units on one lot, right? It's much cheaper to put in a big pipe than it is to put in a long network of pipes
Yep.
to service the same amount of people. Um, and yeah, there's various ways that you can encourage the development of more purpose-built rental housing. One of the things that they're looking at in the Calgary Housing Plan, and I've also heard an advocacy group in Ottawa advocate for the same thing, is to have the government maintain ownership of land that they have in cities
Mm.
and just offer it at a steeply discounted lease or a free lease for a company that's going to come in and build affordable purpose built housing and maintain it over a period of time. Right. So they're essentially trying to put together
Interesting.
a public private partnership where you have the government who has an asset that has some value in the market and then leveraging that asset to produce a public good, which is affordable housing, but have a private company or a nonprofit, something like that, manage the actual day-to-day operations of it. I think that's
Mm.
something that scares off a lot of people about the idea of social housing, is they feel that the government tends to mismanage things, right? I think there's no surprise that there's a sentiment of that. um, a lot of people feel that way.
What they
But
don't in
this,
Vienna.
well, yeah, but
That's
I
what that's
mean,
I think my point is there's like we've been trying this P3 thing for decades, and it's like the public always ends up having to bail out the profit interest, right? There's no accountability with these private companies that sit on public land. And like if they mismanage or the private company funnels too much profits that we don't have sight lines on, it's like, the company will just cry foul ball and say, market, inflation, all that, and it ends up being the public has to bail them out every goddamn time. And that's the thing that I like. I get it. The government doesn't have a great reputation in Canada for being able to manage anything well. We hear it all the time. City Hall couldn't manage a two-car funeral, but like in other parts of the world where they're taxed out the asshole, like 70% marginal tax rates in some of these countries, no one is saying that the government can run a two-car funeral. There's lots of protests in Paris, but in Vienna, it's like everybody is like, no, let's keep this model. It's working. Or even in Helsinki or Stockholm or some of these other countries. So it's like, I don't know, the culture here is like we're always shooting ourselves in the foot. And I don't know, like I guess I don't know. I don't know enough about these P3s from a housing perspective to understand how the public is insulated from the escalation of risk that the private company gets to profit off of. But
yeah, well, in my opinion, this one, I think, or this idea of giving out an inexpensive or free lease,
mhm,
contingent on meeting certain goals and certain amounts for rent, that's kind of what insulates the public from that. And I think,
fair.
to your point, the government can build its reputation by having successful projects. I think something that we have as an issue here is everyone always wants to pay less taxes, and then you end up with um, projects that don't have the resources required to manage them well.
Mhm,
And then you start seeing that just ends up costing you more money in the long run, right? You're wasting your money poorly managing a project that you could have either managed well or not done at all.
Mm.
And so a lot of people think, well, it would be cheaper to not do it at all. But at the same time, if you actually have projects that are done well and infrastructure that's well managed, then that provides more benefit to society than we spent on it. So in this one, where we've got governments who own a lot of land that could
Yep.
be used for housing, but currently we're doing nothing with it.
Hmm.
Um, if they just say, okay, we're going to let you use this land to build a project, and it could be a nonprofit organization, right? There are
Yep.
nonprofits out there that are already successful in providing affordable housing without a big profit motive. Obviously people make money by working there,
Hmm.
but the main point is not to provide, say, shareholder value. So you say, okay, we'll give you the free land lease, we'll waive municipal property taxes on this property as long as you maintain it in good condition and you have the units cost less than this amount. And you can organize that in a way that there is still uh, basically an economic incentive or a workable financial plan to build affordable housing if you are removing that big cost of land and zoning and regulatory issues and development costs.
Mm.
Right? It's
Yeah.
something like, if you look in Toronto or Vancouver, I believe now the cost just for like city development fees, not to do with land or anything like that, just the development fees, it's over over $100,000 to build an apartment.
Just to get started before you've even purchased the land or built the building.
Yes.
Wow.
Jesus, that's insane. We don't even have development cost charges here. It's wild.
Yeah. So there are big hurdles that the government could be in this way subsidizing without spending any money, which I think people would look more favorably upon, right? I mean, there is the sense of like, okay, we have this land and we could be using it for whatever, we could be leasing it for X amount of dollars, but we're not, right?
Hmm.
And instead, we'll just say we'll take this asset we already own and we will leverage it towards achieving this goal of affordable housing. And it's not going to show up on the budget as a cost item, right? It's
Right.
more
A
like
liability. Yeah.
yeah, right? You're not actually spending money. You may be foregoing potential revenue, but
Right.
I think psychologically it's a lot easier for people to deal with the fact that, okay, we're giving out this land for free instead of spending, hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars subsidizing a developer with cash, and then they might just run off with the money and not complete the project.
Mm.
Well, thank you so much, Millennial Moron, for this 52 minutes of fascinating insight into this issue. It's one that plagues us constantly. So I appreciate you unpacking it for people. It's I've seen you share it on more of my friends' feeds than I can count, honestly. So you're making waves.
What's next for you? Like, have you got any sort of like initiatives or projects that you're looking at doing next on your accounts?
Not exactly. I mean, this all kind of happened by accident, right?
Right.
Right now, I'm focusing on this Calgary affordable housing plan, and then hopefully, what I would like for that is, we're looking at one city, and they've got this one plan coming up, but hopefully, getting more people just aware and engaged of what can be done will
Yeah.
maybe start more conversations throughout Canada on it, and get more people engaged in their own local politics and see what can be done, because I do think the solutions need to start coming from all levels, right? The problem is so bad that we can't do these piecemeal bits anymore. We need the federal government and the provincial government and municipal governments all engaged, all pulling in the same direction.
Mm-hmm.
And otherwise we're just not going to find a way out of it.
No, that's great. Any parting shots, Joe?
No, I just want to, once again, thank you for joining us. We're just we just randomly all met on the internet. So thanks,
Yep.
Andrew, our friend Andrew as well, for bringing us together.
Yes.
So yeah, no, this is great. We'll inevitably be talking more about housing. So thanks for
and don't be
giving us more to
surprised.
think about.
Yeah, don't be surprised if we reach out to you again. Because there is no doubt that in the next year, especially as we creep closer to an election, we'd love to have you back to stress test maybe some of these political campaigns on policy and whatnot. But yeah, that's great, and we'll turn it over there, and thanks again for coming out.
Okay, thanks very much.